Happy Halloween, nature detectives. I'm Conrad. I'm an outdoor educator at Letchworth State Park, and today I have a nature mystery for you. I'm right next to the park road, so there might be some vehicles coming and going as we talk, but I couldn't resist coming out here to show you this nature mystery that is steeped in folklore and legends about magic and witchcraft and hidden creatures that might be helpful and benevolent, or might be kind of mean and more sinister. I'm talking about these mushrooms behind me here. If you look, they are in a complete ring, a closed circle, a really bizarre kind of geometric shape that looks like somebody has planted them here intentionally, but that's not the case. This is a completely natural phenomenon, and if we look a little bit more closely, we might be able to figure out what's going on here. If you look at the mushrooms, these are the fruiting bodies of a fungus. The fungus lives underneath the ground. It really, most of the time, looks like dental floss, really white strings growing under the ground. They look kind of like roots, but remember, fungi are not plants. This is a living thing that feeds on other stuff. Can't make its own food like a plant. Most of the other stuff that it will feed on in fungus world is rotting material. You'll see lots of fungi that live just under the soil or in rotting material like fallen logs. And they spread through that material and decompose it, turn it into new soil for the forest. It's one of the most important jobs that a living thing can do in a forest, and these mushrooms are some of the most effective decomposers out there. When it comes time for them to have babies and make more of themselves, they send up the mushroom above ground, and those mushrooms have these little lines underneath. Those little grooves are called gills, and the gills are covered with smoke-like, powder-like dust. It's most of the time invisible to human beings, floats along the forest like smoke or fog, and lands on new areas and starts to grow into new fungus. When that happens with these kinds of mushrooms, this kind of fungus, it starts to try to grow out like a puddle. It wants to spread and eat as much dead stuff as it can in the forest. And then when the spore lands, that's like the bullseye, the middle of the puddle, and it starts to grow from there like a circle. Now that's fine for the first couple years, but because it's an enclosed patch, an enclosed circle, the fungus, as it grows out, eventually eats all of the nutritious material in the middle of the circle. And then the fungus starts to grow not as a puddle, but as a ripple, with no fungi blooming in the middle in that nutrient-poor, already eaten area in the middle, and it starts to grow out like an expanding ring. This particular fungus is obviously a few years into that process and has expanded out into a pretty big ring. As we continue to track the progress of this fungus over the next few years, we'll expect that ring to get larger and larger and larger. As the underground fungus continues to grow, the mushrooms will bloom and fade like flowers, and the fungus will continue to grow year after year under the ground. And then, say 3 or 4 years from now, it could be much larger than this, but completely unexplainably to ancient peoples, which is where the folklore and the rich history of fairy tales about these fairy rings enters into the picture. I'm talking most specifically about Europe, ancient Europe, where the mythology and the folklore of fairy rings is most recognizable to Western Europeans and Americans of European descent. You'll see there are stories about fairies, gnomes. They sometimes will refer to them as the hidden people or the good people. They're supposed to be small creatures that have magical powers that come out at times when humans don't see them, or maybe they have magical powers that protect them from our non-magical human eyes. So they're dancing, they're singing, they're interacting with other powerful magical beings, and they are casting their magic around in the forest. And what pops up in the morning after they've done their rituals but mushrooms, according to ancient folklore. Sometimes a fairy ring will pop up with a tree in the middle. And the idea in folklore is that the fairies or the hidden people are protecting that tree because they live in it or it's a sacred place for them. There was a lot of folklore around fairy rings, a lot of fascination, and in some cases, a lot of fear. In ancient times, sometimes these were called witches' rings instead of fairy rings, which has a more kind of a sinister connotation. It sounds kind of evil and scary. You'll see sometimes some stories of people walking into fairy rings uninvited by the magical creatures. Sometimes they'll be cursed for life for going into those fairy rings. Or sometimes you'll see stories of livestock like horses or sheep that walk into a fairy ring or eat grass from the middle of a fairy ring, and they fall down dead immediately, cursed by the good folk or the hidden people. Sometimes their powers were not only to be admired, but they were to be feared. There's a rich history of folklore and legend about fairy rings and witches' rings that persists to this very day. If you notice, you won't catch me today going into the middle of that fairy ring, just in case. Now, this isn't the only fairy ring in Letchworth State Park, not by any means. These brightly colored mushrooms are easy to see from a distance, so if you're on a hike, especially in the area of Inspiration Point or in the Hogsback Overlook in Letchworth State Park, you might be able to find some of these brightly colored fairy rings before they disappear for the fall. And you might be able to find some fairy rings in your neighborhood. Make sure you check in the woods, but also check in the lawns. Remember, some of those mushrooms will live cooperatively, symbiotically with plants like grass, and they'll continue to grow year after year if you keep checking on them. If you notice that there are some mushrooms growing in a small cluster, that might be the start of a fairy ring. So you can come back and check on it year after year and see if it grows into a larger and larger fairy ring. Just be careful not to step into the middle without permission from those powerful creatures that might have made them. Well, thank you so much for joining me for today's Halloween Nature Mystery. If you have any questions about fungi that you might find in the forest, please put a comment in the comment section below the video. Share this video with your friends to put their nature detective skills to the test. And as always, like Letchworth State Park's Facebook page and follow us on Instagram to stay tuned for more nature mysteries.